Hello, my name is Corey Jorbin, and I'm the Chief Compliance Officer for Hub's West Region. Today, I'm going to be talking about charting an unfamiliar course in employee benefits. So today, we're going to talk about regulatory updates that we've seen in response to COVID-19 and employee benefits. We're also going to talk about layoffs and furloughs and what those mean for employee benefits purposes. And then finally, we're going to talk about returning to work and what that means for employers as they look to manage their employee benefits programs. So with that, let's jump right into the regulatory updates. So the first and foremost change that we saw to employee benefits plans has been that COVID-19 testing and preventive care is required to be covered without cost sharing. Now, what that means is that for plan participants, they get to have testing for COVID-19 and they do not have to pay for it. Of course, someone does have to pay for it, and that someone is going to be employer-sponsored plans. Now, what is testing? So this environment is actually very fluid because there's more tests coming to market. There's different tests available in certain markets, but I can tell you that the definition of testing is very, very expansive. Now, what prices do plans have to pay for testing? That answer depends on whether or not the provider is in-network or out-of-network. If the provider is in-network, then of course the plan is going to pay that negotiated rate. However, if the provider is out-of-network, well, that's when the plan is going to have to pay the cash price. Those cash prices, they do have to be posted by providers, or those providers are going to be penalized. The next change that we've seen has been in regard to telehealth. So obviously, with many areas of the country shut down in various capacities, one of the things that has been impacted has been non-emergency medical appointments. So in regard to that, many more employees are using telemedicine. In fact, the insurance carriers on the fully insured side, they were actually the ones that first started including telemedicine in their plans without cost sharing. Now, this presented some questions for high deductible health plans. Well, finally, the IRS ultimately did end up coming out with information saying that providing telemedicine without cost sharing, so no cost to the employee, was going to be considered compatible with high deductible health plans for this year, 2020, as well as through the end of 2021. Another change that we've seen has been in regard to over-the-counter drugs and women's care products related to FSA and HSAs. So previously, in another life, FSAs and HSAs could be used on over-the-counter medications. Well, that changed a number of years ago. And in fact, since that change was made, plan participants could not use those HSA funds or FSA funds on over-the-counter medication. Well, once again, this has been added back. So those over-the-counter medications, Tylenol, Benadryl, Claritin, these are all now allowed to be covered under HSAs and FSAs. Likewise, certain women's care products related to menstruation are also now allowed to be considered eligible expenses under these plans. More recently, we've seen some changes as it relates to COBRA, and there's two different components of this. The first part is the extended notice period that plans are allowed to use. This essentially just provides a little bit more notice that, or rather more time that plans can take to provide notice to employees with regard to COBRA. The second, and probably the more important piece, is actually the extended COBRA deadlines related to COBRA elections and COBRA payments. Here on this slide, we've actually illustrated what those deadlines now are. So essentially, the government decided that there's going to be an outbreak period. That outbreak period, it began on March 1st, and it hasn't ended yet. It needs to end by the end of February 2021, but the government hasn't decided when exactly it will end yet. essentially during that outbreak period, any kind of COBRA payment or COBRA election period that was in progress is paused. So for example, plan participants who are COBRA beneficiaries would traditionally have 60 days to elect COBRA. However, because of this pause during the outbreak period, they now would get 60 days following the end of the outbreak period. This also impacts payment for COBRA. So for example, you could have an individual that elected COBRA, but they haven't made payment. Normally, if they don't make that initial payment within 45 days, they're going to lose their coverage. However, this outbreak period is now adding additional time for them to make those payments. Another area where we've seen changes has been with regard to special enrollment rights. These are certain qualifying events that allow individuals that are eligible for the plan to change their elections. This could mean adding a new dependent, or it could mean someone who lost other coverage and it now wants to come onto the plan. Normally, there's timeframes associated with these events too. So for example, if you have a new child, you need to add that child to the coverage within 30 days, otherwise they are not eligible to be added. Now, under these new changes that we're seeing, that election period is again paused, just like the COBRA periods. So what ends up happening here is a person could have a child, and then now that that election period is being paused by the outbreak period, they get 30 days from the end of the outbreak period to go ahead and add that dependent. Now, for employers, I would say the biggest issues with regard to this have to do with the fact that you could have individuals that want coverage retroactively by several months. This presents a huge challenge, not only for employers to manage that, but also for employers to collect these premiums that ultimately would end up being owed retroactively. Most recently, we've seen some changes regarding mid-year election changes. So these are very similar to the HIPAA special enrollment rights. However, these fall under a different bucket of qualifying events. These are the permitted election changes under the IRS cafeteria plan rules. Now, with these rules, the catch is that unlike the HIPAA rules, these are optional. So essentially, plans can choose to allow these. They can allow some of them, all of them, or none of them. Now, what this really does is it offers a couple different expansions for employees. So first, it allows employees that previously waived coverage to enroll. Likewise, it allows employees that maybe they are enrolled in one PPO plan today with you, the opportunity to enroll in another PPO or another high deductible health plan. And then finally, it allows employees that are enrolled today to drop employer-sponsored coverage so long as they attest in writing that they either currently have other coverage or they immediately will have other coverage. So right now, I can tell you that employers are asking a lot of questions on these items because they're just not sure what they should ultimately do here. I can tell you that for the most part, employers are being flexible. However, they are placing some restrictions on what employees can actually do. For example, because there's no event here, it's really just a change that is being allowed. Many employers are still placing time restrictions on these changes that can be made. Likewise, there have been some changes related to dependent care FSAs and health FSAs. So these changes would allow individuals to revoke those elections or reduce those elections or even increase those elections if they want. Employers, especially on the health FSA side, are concerned about possibly having some risk exposure. So to that point, those that are allowing health FSA changes, they're either limiting those changes to only increases in contributions, or if they're allowing decreases in contributions, they're only allowing individuals to reduce those contributions to the lesser of, or rather the greater of, the amount elected or the amount spent to date. The idea is that employers don't want to be on the hook for an employee that might have elected $2,000 and has already spent $1,200, but only contributed $800. So these are just some of the examples of the changes that have come more recently to employee benefits plans. Now let's change course and talk about furloughs and layoffs. Right now, these are some of the things that many employers are working through. And there are some important differences between what a furlough means and what a layoff means. So I know sometimes that different definitions are used for these. So let me just set the record straight, at least for our purposes here. So a furlough is where the employer-employee relationship remains intact, but the employee is either having their hours reduced or maybe reduced even down to zero. While a layoff, this is a complete termination of employment. There's no longer an employer and employee relationship present. That, of course, is going to trigger an offer of COBRA, along with a number of other benefits-related changes that we have gone ahead and outlined here for your reference. So a couple different considerations with regard to furlough. So most employers that I've seen, they're looking to continue benefits at least for a certain period of time during that furlough. Now, it's not required that employers do that, and many other employers are moving employees over to COBRA during this time. The advantage, of course, for employees is that if they're kept on active coverage, then the employer is still bound to make their employer contributions towards benefits, which means employees pay a lower cost overall as compared to if they were paying the full COBRA premium. Now, if employers are picking up that full cost, they need to think about whether or not they truly want to pick that up, or if they just want to pick that up temporarily and have those employees repay those premiums upon returning to work. So I can tell you that based on what I've seen, employers are doing any of these options. Some are requiring employees to make those payments periodically. Others are requiring the employees to pay the money back when they come back to work. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that if you are requiring employees to make those premium payments while they're not working, then you as the employer do need to have a process to manage that. So that means allowing employees to make payments. You have to describe how you want them to make the payments and when they need to make the payments. Whereas if you have an employee that you're essentially moving them to COBRA during a furlough, now that's going to either fall on you if you in your own COBRA, or that obligation to collect payments is going to be transferred over to the COBRA vendor. Now, of course, keep in mind those changes that I just made regarding COBRA, because remember, because those changes, everything is changing overall from a process. One final note here is that employers, as you're deciding what you want to do from a benefits perspective, if you want to keep benefits intact during a furlough, or if you want to move individuals to COBRA, you need to confirm with your insurance carrier or your stop-loss carrier what they will allow. Employers can't just keep employees on indefinitely if they're not working, if their insurance carrier, who's ultimately responsible for making those payments, or their stop-loss carrier doesn't agree to that. So let's take a look at some additional considerations here regarding benefits and furlough. So, of course, we need to keep in mind some things related to the Affordable Care Act. So here what we've outlined is where you have a situation where there's an employee that was hired as full-time, meaning they were offered benefits within 90 days of the date of hire. Now, there's a couple different options. Obviously, we need to take into consideration those rules that I just mentioned, but sometimes we're dealing with situations related to a change in status where maybe the employee, they're not completely furloughed, but their hours are reduced. That's where we do have the potential to use what's described here at the bottom of this page as the downshift rule. This is where you would take a look at the employee's hours over a 3-month period to determine if they actually average less than 130 hours per month during that period. If they do, then on the first day of the 4th month following that change in status, you can take away their benefits. Of course, at that point, there would be potential penalty exposure if that employee turned around and went to the exchange and received a subsidy and also happened to work more than 130 hours during any additional month. Now, keep in mind that this rule, this downshift rule, it can only be used for people that were offered benefits within the first 90 days of their date of hire. So if you have an employee that was hired as a variable hour employee, meaning they went through the measurement period and then that determined that they were ultimately eligible for benefits, and that's how they gained their benefits eligibility. You cannot use the downshift rule during that stability period. For those employees, obviously we still have potential qualifying events available like we had just mentioned. Or, of course, we should always keep in mind that if employees don't pay their portion of the premiums, then of course coverage can be terminated for non-payment. One note on that: if active coverage is terminated for non-payment, that is not a COBRA qualifying event. It's not consistent with the regulations. And then further, the thinking behind this is that if an employee isn't paying the lower active rate, they're also not going to pay the even higher COBRA rate. But very important to recognize that termination of coverage for non-payment does not then turn around and lead to an offer of COBRA. We also need to consider what layoffs and furloughs mean from an ACA perspective with regard to hours. So for your variable hour employee population, remember, we of course need to count hours actually worked, but there's a number of other categories that we describe here of hours that need to be counted towards that measurement period. So any kind of paid leave, so this includes any kind of paid leave under the emergency paid sick leave or emergency FMLA, or if the employee is just using their vacation time or sick time, these hours are included in that ACA calculation. If someone is collecting disability under a state statutory disability program, that does not count. Likewise, if an employee is collecting unemployment, this also does not count for ACA hours purposes. Finally, down at the bottom, if an employer is paying or the employee is paying on a pre-tax basis for short-term disability or long-term disability premiums, then those hours would count. Personally, I think this is very important that employers keep in mind, just because, especially for the calendar year plans, as we move through the remainder of 2020 and into 2021, there could be employees that are currently eligible, but if their hours are reduced, they might end up losing that benefits eligibility. So I can tell you that I've already talked to several employers that are reevaluating their measurement periods just because they want to be able to maintain coverage for their employees that might otherwise potentially lose it as a result of not working the correct amount of hours, not averaging more than 30 hours per week or 130 hours per month. Okay, so we've talked a lot about what it means for employees that are on leaves of absence, what it means for them during a furlough. Now let's talk about some of the issues that employers are going to be dealing with once employees actually return to work, which in some parts of the country, it's actually already happening. So first we need to take a look at the ACA rehire or new hire rules. So for these purposes, we're concerned about breaks in service. This would be a time where there's no hours worked, so 0 hours per week, of 13 weeks for non-educational institutions, or 26 weeks in the case of educational institutions. So if the break in service is less than 13 weeks, then an employee is treated as a rehire under the ACA. That means they need to immediately become eligible for benefits when they are returning to work. Now, what does immediately mean? For some employers, they're able to accomplish this on that first day the employee is working. However, the regulations say that immediately is satisfied as long as the coverage is in place by the first of the month following the return to work. We also need to consider cafeteria plan rules here. Some cafeteria plans, they contain provisions that say if the employee is separated for less than 30 days and they are rehired, they automatically go back into the same elections that they had before. This is really something that employers have implemented as a way to cut down on their administrative obligations. Then on the other side of the slide here, we have what breaks in service of greater than 13 weeks triggers. And under the ACA, this would trigger someone being considered a new hire. So you could have an employee that works for you for 5 years, but if they're gone for 16 weeks and you rehire them, they would have to satisfy that waiting period before they would be eligible for coverage under your plan, at least in the eyes of the ACA. Now, it is possible, and I've seen employers have more generous language than is required by the ACA. I've seen 6-month rehire provisions. I've seen 1-year rehire provisions. However, the most important component of being more generous is that it needs to be written into your policy language if you're going to be more generous than is required by the ACA. Employers are also likely going to be taking a look at their contribution structures as we start to return to work, and especially as we look towards renewal towards 2021. So over here on the right, we have what I call a pool of benefits. And I would say that many employers are going to be looking at their budget pools and then all these benefits to figure out what they need to do in order to meet their budgetary requirements. So this could mean decreasing contributions under a medical plan. So the employer is going to pay less of that, which means the employee is going to have to pay more. Likewise, it could mean taking benefits such as short-term disability or long-term disability and moving them from 100% employer paid to maybe a voluntary program or maybe a contributory program, such as where the employer pays 50% of the cost. Also, I can tell you that voluntary benefits are going to be an important component of this too, especially as employers seek to kind of take away some of their requirements from a funding perspective and push more costs onto employees. One other important thing of note here is that with regard to benefits like life insurance in the basic life sense or short-term disability, long-term disability, anything that is 100% employer paid and changes to maybe contributory or changes to voluntary status, that is likely going to bring with it a rate change. The reason is that when you have a benefit that's 100% employer paid, that carrier has that guaranteed participation. Whereas if an employee is required to pay for all or some of the cost of that, the carrier is likely going to see lower participation, which then impacts the rates. So again, these are all considerations that employers need to keep in mind, especially as they're looking at their contributions for both the remainder of 2020 and the 2021 renewals. Finally, I want to wrap up my section by talking about ALE status. So remember, ALE status means applicable large employer, and this means whether or not an employer is subject to the employer mandate. I've talked to a number of employers that they've reduced their headcounts to the points where even though they might have had over 100 lives last year and the year before and even the year before that, now they've reduced their headcounts so much that they might no longer be considered an applicable large employer. So as part of that, I've kind of outlined some of the steps that employers need to be taking here. So one, if you are now under 50 full-time equivalent employees, you should recognize this. And then later in the year, you should take a look at this to see how you're averaging throughout the year. If you're averaging less than 50 full-time equivalent employees come October, November, there's a very good chance that depending on what those numbers are, you might end up not being an applicable large employer come January 1st. If that's the case, you're no longer subject to the employer mandate. That means you no longer need to make sure that your coverage is affordable. You likewise no longer need to make sure that you're offering coverage to 95% of your full-time employees. Of course, this can change from year to year too. So even though an employer might be an applicable large employer some years and not other years, it's very important that they recognize when these requirements are and are not triggered. An employer that's an applicable large employer today in 2020, this is based on their 2019 employee count. So that means that even if they go below 50, they would still be obligated to complete ACA reporting, at least based on what we know now, in 2021 for the 2020 calendar year. So overall, I would just say that it's important that employers recognize when they're kind of near 50 employees or not, just so that they recognize that they might not be subject to the employer mandate next year, Just like it's important for employers that maybe they're coming up to that 50 employee mark and they might be subject to the ACA employer mandate for the first time next year. So these are all things that employers need to consider overall. Finally, down to the bottom, we know that for very first time applicable large employers, they essentially get a delay from when they need to comply with the employer mandate as long as certain conditions are met. They get to wait until April 1st of that following year before they would truly need to be subject to the employer mandate, so long as they do comply by April 1st. This delay until April 1st is only good for very first time applicable large employers. So if you're a large employer, that some years you are a large employer, other years you're not a large employer, you should recognize that you only get this exception once, and every other time that you are an applicable large employer, that obligation is going to be triggered based on the calendar year, so January 1st. That brings my section to an end. I hope you've enjoyed today's presentation, and thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to listen to our presentation today. Thank you.